Sanitation. It's so important. It may seem obvious to you because you can go to the loo in the back of the room, or you can go to the loo at your house. It's so easy and obvious, and you don't need to think about it. But in developing countries, it's not so easy. And if people go to the loo out in the open, there's very serious risks of contamination, of flies landing on excrement and then landing on food, and then disease passing. And once disease starts to pass, there's no backup plan, there's no health facility, there's no medication, and you're in very serious difficulty. So it's really important. Various types of toilets that we use. We've got deep pits that we dig in the ground. We use the heat of the sun to decontaminate effluent. We've got community-led total sanitation, which is a really successful model where we give the community absolutely nothing. There's no materials handed over, and we say to the community, come over here and we'll have, for example, a glass of water, and we'll say, drink that, and everyone will say, that water's lovely. And then you get a hair and you dip it on some poo, and you just tap the top of the water and you say, now would you like to drink some water? And of course everybody's horrified at the thought of drinking water where you've dripped a hair that's been in dung. But the reality is, when you explain it, flies are doing that all of the time, and immediately people are horrified by that thought. And you ask them, what could you do to prevent that? Could you dig a hole in the ground? And within days, the entire community is digging great big holes in the ground to dig their own latrines. It's a really successful model. It's called community-led total sanitation. And we try and use that. You can't use it everywhere. You have to use it in areas where there aren't alternatives or people getting toilets for free from another organisation or in an urban environment. So it's difficult. And maybe what I'm saying in this is that aid work and some of the interventions are complicated. It's not simple. It's not as simple as handing out stuff. And there's a lot of science, there's a lot of engineering, and a lot of thinking behind it. Okay? Institutional access included for the disabled. So what we provide must think about more than just you and me. We must think about a lot of different considerations. The growing focus on sanitation marketing within goal. Within the urban environment, one of the biggest growing issues is, with increased urbanization, the populations of cities increasing, is providing adequate sanitation. One of the ways of dealing with sanitation is making a business out of it. You can process effluent to generate gas and fertilizer, and there are nutrients within effluent. And for effluent to be collected and sold on, there's potential for business. So there's trial projects and micro projects being run to see if there's potential for these types of projects. And there's an ongoing debate about sanitation subsidies, which I won't get into with you now. Here you can see some photographs again of some of the facilities that we provide. Hygiene promotion. There is no point in providing clean water and sanitation facilities unless we educate the community, unless we get the, communities in remote areas who don't have this awareness to understand what the risks are associated with poor hygiene and what the benefits are associated with good hygiene. And it's the most important part of the work we do. In Haiti, for example, we didn't have the materials to mobilize our physical intervention immediately in the area of sanitation. So we focused on hygiene promotion. That was all about wash your hands, be aware of hygiene, and reinforcing that message all the time. Cholera struck Haiti for the first time. It had never had cholera previously, a deadly disease that can kill within hours. And because of the strong work that was done on hygiene promotion, the effects of cholera were very significantly limited because people knew what the dangers were. They knew what they could do themselves to limit their risk, and it didn't spread as badly as it might have. It obviously remains a risk, an ongoing risk. So it's typically focused on key messaging surrounding hand washing with soap, use of sanitation facilities, safe water chain, and general hygiene. A variety of methods are used to spread this message. Hygiene kits distributed. So hygiene kit is basically soap, toothpaste, sanitary towels, etc. The challenge remains on how to change and measure actual behaviour. What we talk about there is, which is appropriate for Science Week, it is a science. It's not just simply going out, handing out stuff. We need to study what we do. We need to look at the effects of our interventions. So when we run a project within a community, we need to know what difference did that make. So we need to measure what was the status before we became involved, what did we do, what were the outcomes, how can we measure those outcomes, and how can those outcomes inform us on how we should maybe change the program or how we should expand the program, okay? And that's what makes us better. Here you can see some of our hygiene interventions. It's all about communications. You see the teddy washing the hand. It's all about communication. How do we communicate the message? Well, that message is very clear, but it also is attractive to kids. So kids see, okay, I get that, and that's important. All right? The other photograph shows distribution of hygiene kits and hygiene promotion. Sometimes we need to bring all of the components together, and this is where we talk about emergency response. So what we talk about here is, again, Haiti is a really good example, where everything was wiped out. We landed on the ground, and we had to get everything in place immediately. So there was a huge amount of materials to be brought in, a lot of coordination between different organizations, a huge amount of money to be spent. It's a very significant operation, but it needs to happen today because, as I said to you, people can only last days without water. So immediately we must find water, find some way of bottling it, find some way of getting it to the people. And there are, if you don't do that, people panic, then there's violence. So there's a lot of reasons why we need to be very aggressive in terms of how we execute that kind of an intervention. Here, the photographs here show us flying into an area, and you can see a camp below. On the next photograph here, you can see that's a bladder. In other words, it's a big bag of water. And you can see another bladder here, which is elevated. And then here you can see a distribution. We've got a pipe here with taps on either side. People are filling their jerry cans or their containers with water. Other things. Okay, so what else do we talk about in terms of our intervention? Well, we talk about proposals. In order for us to execute our projects, we need to write proposals. We need to explain to our donors what it is that we're going to do. So for a water project, it could cost 200, 300, 400,000 euros. It's not cheap. It's very expensive. To do that, we need to design the project. So if it's a gravity-fed water system through pipes from the mountain, it needs to be designed. We need to put a price on it, and then we need to go to the donors. So where do we go to the donors? Our principal donors are the US government, the Irish government, the British government, and Europe. They're our principal donors. We get a lot of money from the public. But our principal donors are, for example, the governments. So when we go to the governments, they also have budgets that they need to spend on the emergency. They've allocated a budget to the emergency, and they're politically accountable. So the politicians, for example, in Ireland, will have given money to an emergency. The politicians are screaming at their technical departments for progress on the projects. They're demanding from us proposals so they can fund our projects. And then we have to deliver on what we've said that we're going to provide within the time frame that we've said that we're going to provide. So that puts a huge amount of pressure on us. And there's a huge amount of pressure on both sides. Everyone must deliver. The benefit of delivering is that, for example, in Haiti, we got a phone call from the government. Here, we got a phone call from the US government who said, what can you do for us? Can you go in to Haiti? Can you implement? Then when we arrive on the ground, we say, look, this is what we can do. Agree a budget, and then we execute. And so there's a confidence between the governments and organisations like GOAL in terms of what we're going to achieve, and then we simply deliver. So developing budgets. Monitoring and evaluation. So I've talked about, in terms of our interventions, in the provision of water, in the provision of sanitation, on promoting hygiene, and through the various approaches that we adopt. Monitoring and evaluation is key for us. We need to know what was the situation before we started the project. We need to study that. We need to come up with ways of measuring it. When we execute the project, we need to monitor the success of it. And when the project is finished, we need to know, was it a success or not? And we need to develop lessons learned from that. So it's quite academic. And I'm not sure if maybe you thought, before I started this talk, if the work that organisations like GOAL do is about giving stuff to people, or about building houses for them, or about, giving them materials or food. It's really not what it's about. That's at the very start, and we must move away from that as quickly as possible. But monitoring and evaluation is so important for us to be able to scientifically measure and report success and failure, because there's often failures associated with what we do, and we need to be able to measure that and be honest enough to say that didn't work, we need to change away from that model. And out of that comes new ingenious approaches, such as community-led total sanitation, which is an approach which minimises our investment in terms of hardware, and all the focus is on education. Mainstreaming. So we do a lot of work on, for example, HIV and AIDS, and on protection, in other words, protecting mothers and children, and other such issues, which crosses all of the work that we do. So if we're providing shelter, if we're providing water and sanitation, if we're providing nutrition or health interventions, there are issues that we need to carry through all of that work. Coordination. In many emergencies, there are so many organisations working in the same area, and you may wonder, how do you decide where you're going to work? How do you decide what you're going to do? How is it that you are putting in that well or providing sanitation to that community? That comes down to coordination. And in an emergency, you need to be very dynamic, you need to be very aggressive in terms of working with other organisations, deciding very quickly what you will do. The UN provides a coordination or cluster grouping where we all meet, we talk together about who's doing what, who has the best skill sets, who has the money, and how we're going to structure this. So coordination is extremely important. Accountability. When we're delivering our interventions, when we're implementing our projects, it's really important that we don't look at it as if we're giving stuff to people. We're all stakeholders in this, and the community are just as important in the process as we are. Sometimes they're just not happy with what we're doing, and it's important that they can communicate that back, because they must be the centre of what we're doing. There's lots of history of implementing projects where we have, for example, given water tanks, for example, or latrines, where the people just didn't get it. They didn't know what they were getting. They didn't buy into it. They didn't know that they were going to have to pay for its maintenance. And so there's major conflict. So it's really important that we communicate with the communities so that they can feed back to us about what they're happy with and what they're not happy with. And they can be demanding. So, you may think that, isn't it great for them? They're getting all this stuff for free. It's not. Often it's not like that. And the communities you work with are rightly demanding of us, and that makes us perform better. Reporting. I've talked to you a lot about reporting to donors and being accountable for what we do. Recruitment. It's very hard to get into the area of development. It's not an easy sector to get into. It's also an extremely difficult area to get out of. So once you're in, and you're in very high demand. It's very easy to get work with organisations. We're always looking for people who are highly competent in the area we work in. So it's quite funny. It's hard to get into, but it's really hard to get out of. I'll leave that. Community-based, so organisation types in WASH. So who do we work with? We work with community-based organisations or local partners or partners who represent the community in which we work in. Ultimately, we want them to take ownership of the work we do. As an international organisation, we want to limit the number of expatriates or Irish or foreigners who've come into the country. We want to increase the capacity and the competence of the local staff so that we're not relied upon, so that ultimately we can leave. Local non-governmental organisations, they are us in country. International organisations, other organisations like Goal, like Concern, like Trócaire, maybe organisations who specialise in water and sanitation if we have another particular skill set in that country. UN agencies, often for coordination, for providing of peacekeeping, etc. Donors, they're the ones who provide the money. That's really important to us. But it's not just a top-down. It's not them telling us, okay, I'd like you to go and do this there. I'd like to build a water system there. It's nothing like that. We tell the donors what they should be investing in. They decide that, yeah, I'll definitely invest in that. They give us the money, we execute, and then we report back to them on how it was a success or failure. And then independently, they'll do their own assessments. Research institutions. It's appropriate, again, for Science Week to explain that research institutions are all of the time developing new technologies and new approaches to what we do. So some of the kit we have here, it's quite scientific, what we can do now in the field. There's now electronic mechanisms for measuring the success of water. We now have water purification or filtration systems that come on the back of a truck that can provide water supplies to whole towns. And science is developing all the time around this. We talk about solar and decontamination of practically black and turbid water. And, there's always technology coming on stream. Science has a huge role to play in the work that we do. Increased private sector involvement. That's all about money. There's private companies stand to gain a lot for coming up with new ideas, new ways of selling sanitation. It's a guaranteed market. People need to drink and people need to go to the toilet. It's not something that has been solved. So there is an interest in the private sector investing in technologies that will sell in development. Careers in WASH. Goal is, as I explained to you, always has vacancies, but it's really difficult to get into. So how can you get involved? Volunteering for some organisations. Travelling. If you travel to some of the developing countries, maybe Central America, maybe Africa. Volunteering for organisations and countries. It's a good way of getting involved. And then through studies, do engineering, do science, keep a keen interest in development issues, and do some of your studies, some of your projects on the areas of development. Try to link with an agency for a master's project. Again, as I say, it's notoriously tricky to get involved. Working with Goal and what Goal offer. So there's a couple of points here about what it is to work with Goal. It is a fun job. You will not work in another job that's as much fun as working in development. You get to travel the world. You get to parachute into the most amazing countries, the most remote areas of the world, and do some very exciting work. So it's quite enjoyable. So just closing off there, if we've any questions, I think we're going to postpone the questions until after Tom speaks.